A submarine is a marine designed to survive the apocalypse, yet it remains terrifyingly vulnerable to the smallest human error. In the freezing silence of the Barents Sea, far from any enemy fleet, a crew of 68 men is about to learn that safety is nothing more than a fragile illusion. They do not know it yet, but the steel hull protecting them from the ocean has already become their tomb. How can a submarine sink when no one is shooting at it? This is the question that haunts the history of naval warfare, lingering like a dark shadow over the official reports and the pristine memorials. We understand the logic of combat. If a destroyer drops depth charges, or if a torpedo strikes the hull, the destruction has a clear cause. It is the brutal mathematics of war. But what happens when the destruction arrives in total silence? What happens when a submarine sinks within sight of its own coast, or tied quietly to its own pier, or during a routine training exercise that thousands of sailors have performed before? The central paradox of the stories we are about to explore is the complete absence of an enemy. In the vast majority of these cases, there was no American hunter-killer group tracking them. There were no mines floating in the water. There was no extreme, desperate mission to save the homeland. The seas were often calm, the political situation was stable, and the orders were mundane. Yet, despite this apparent safety, dozens of men died. They died in the crushing dark, often waiting for a rescue that the system was too slow or too paralyzed to provide. This is not a story about accidents. To call them accidents is to suggest they were random strokes of bad luck, unavoidable acts of God that no one could have foreseen. The reality is far more unsettling. This is a story about deaths that never had to happen. It is a story about a military culture that often valued the schedule more than the ship, and the ship more than the crew. It is an examination of how pressure, fatigue, and the illusion of invincibility can turn a routine morning into a catastrophe. Over the course of this journey, we will look closely at 5 specific submarines. 5 different vessels, 5 different crews, spanning the height of the Cold War. In total, nearly 180 men lost their lives in these events. Each disaster has its own specific mechanical trigger: a frozen valve, a burst pipe, a short circuit, or a chemical leak. But if you look past the technical details, you begin to see a single, repeating pattern. It is a pattern of systemic failure where the warning signs were ignored until the water was already rising. We begin in the unforgiving waters of the Barents Sea in the winter of 1961. The Cold War is entering one of its most intense phases. The construction yards are churning out new hulls at a feverish pace, and the Northern Fleet is pushing its crews to the limit to master these machines. Among these vessels is the S-80. She is a Project 644 submarine, a modification of the relentless Whiskey class. She is a diesel-electric boat, a workhorse of the fleet, not a glamorous experimental prototype. She is 250 feet long, crowded, noisy, and smelling of diesel fuel and damp wool. On the night of January 26, the S-80 is engaged in a standard training exercise. The mission is simple: conduct a solo patrol, test the equipment, and return to base. It is the kind of mission that barely warrants a footnote in a naval career. The crew, commanded by Captain 3rd Rank Anatoly Sitarchuk, is experienced. They know the ship, they know the waters, but they are operating in one of the most hostile environments on Earth. The Barents Sea in January is a place of perpetual twilight and violent weather. On this particular night, the ocean is churning. A severe storm is blowing, whipping the waves into a frenzy. The air temperature is far below freezing, hovering around 0 degrees Fahrenheit. The wind cuts through the darkest clothing. It is a miserable night to be at sea. But for the Soviet Navy, bad weather is not a reason to cancel a drill. If war comes, it will likely come in weather just like this. The S-80 is operating at periscope depth, running on her diesel engines. To do this while submerged, she is using her snorkel system. In Russian, this is known as the RDP, the device for underwater operation of diesel engines, or Rabota Dieselia pod vodoi. It is effectively a long steel straw that extends from the conning tower up to the surface. It sucks in fresh air to feed the massive diesel engines and vents the exhaust gases back out. Running on the snorkel is a delicate balancing act. The submarine is hanging just beneath the surface, blind and deaf to the world above, tethered to the air by this thin metal pipe. The noise of the diesels sucking in air is deafening inside the hull, vibrating through the steel plates. The boat rocks and sways with the swell of the waves above. It is an uncomfortable, loud, and disorienting way to travel, but it is standard procedure. The danger of snorkeling in a storm is well known. If a large wave washes over the top of the snorkel mast, a float valve is supposed to slam shut instantly to prevent water from pouring down the pipe and into the engine room. When the valve shuts, the engines, still hungry for air, will momentarily suck the oxygen out of the submarine's interior, causing a painful drop in pressure that makes the crew's ears pop and eyes bulge. It is a miserable experience, but it keeps the water out. But on this night, the cold is the real enemy. The spray from the freezing waves is hitting the snorkel mast and instantly turning into ice. Layer by layer, the ice builds up around the intake valve. The mechanism, designed to float freely and seal the pipe, begins to stiffen. The tolerances are tight. The ice is relentless. At some point in the darkness, the S-80 turns. The waves are now hitting the ship from a different angle. The rolling of the submarine becomes more pronounced. And then, the critical failure occurs. A massive wave crashes over the snorkel. The float valve tries to slam shut, but the ice blocks it. It jams in the open position. The ocean, under the immense pressure of the wave, finds the opening. Gallons of freezing seawater begin to pour down the wide intake pipe. It rushes past the jams, down the steel throat of the snorkel, and erupts into the fifth compartment, the engine room. This is not a trickle. It is a fire hose of freezing brine, blasting into a space filled with hot engines, high-voltage electrical equipment, and men. This is the moment that separates life from death. In a submarine, a flood is the ultimate emergency. The standard procedure is brutal and immediate. Blow all ballast tanks, emergency surface. You use high-pressure air to force the water out of the tanks and shoot the submarine to the surface like a cork. You sacrifice stealth, you sacrifice the mission, you sacrifice the engines if necessary, but you save the buoyancy. But on the S-80, something strange happens. There is a delay. The investigators who would later analyze the disaster struggled to understand this pause. Why didn't the officer in the engine room scream for an emergency surface the instant the water hit the deck? The prevailing theory is one of psychological denial. It is a common human reaction in disasters. The mind refuses to believe that a catastrophic failure is happening during a routine event. Perhaps the crew thought it was just a splash, a minor leak that could be managed with a bilge pump. Perhaps they didn't want to panic the control room over a few gallons of water. It's just a small issue, they might have told themselves. We can fix it. But the ocean does not negotiate. The S-80 is a heavy boat. She is already trimmed to be neutrally buoyant, hovering in the water. Every gallon of water that enters adds 8 pounds of weight. Within seconds, hundreds of gallons have poured into the bilge. The delicate balance of buoyancy is destroyed. The submarine immediately becomes heavier than the water it is displacing. The laws of physics take over. The S-80 stops hovering and begins to sink. By the time the alarm finally sounds, it is too late. The water in the engine room is rising fast. The diesels choke and die. The electrical systems short out in showers of sparks, plunging the compartment into darkness. The heavy stern of the submarine begins to drag the ship down. The bow tilts up toward the surface. an angle that becomes steeper with every passing second. In the control room, the captain would have felt the deck lurch beneath his feet. He would have seen the depth gauge needle begin to spin, slowly at first, then faster. 20 feet, 40 feet, 60 feet. He shouts the orders now. Blow main ballast, emergency surface. But the physics are against him. The ballast tanks are blowing, the air is hissing, but the weight of the water in the aft compartment is an anchor dragging them down. The tragedy of the S-80 is that the point of no return was crossed in silence. There was no explosion, there was no collision. There was just a valve that didn't close, and a crew that hesitated for perhaps 10 seconds too long. As the submarine drops below periscope depth, the radio antennas are submerged. There is no time to send an SOS. The S-80 vanishes from the surface of the Barents Sea without a whisper. 1 minute she is there, her snorkel cutting through the whitecaps, her engines rumbling. The next minute, there is only the empty, storm-tossed ocean. Inside the hull, the terror is absolute. The angle of the deck is now severe, perhaps 45 degrees. Men are sliding, grabbing onto pipes and wheels to keep from falling. Tools, books, and loose equipment are crashing into the aft bulkheads. The lights flicker and die, leaving only the dim, battery-powered emergency lamps casting long, swinging shadows. The S-80 plummets past her operating depth. She is falling toward the seabed. The crew knows what happens when a submarine goes too deep. The hull will groan, then buckle, then implode. But the Barents Sea in this area is relatively shallow, about 600 feet deep. It is deep enough to kill, but not deep enough to crush the hull instantly. The submarine impacts the bottom with a jarring crash. The silence returns, heavier than before. 68 men are now trapped on the floor of the Arctic Ocean. They are alive. The hull is intact. The air is still breathable. But they are miles from home, under 600 feet of freezing water, and no one on the surface knows they are missing. For the Naval Command back at the base, the disaster registers only as a silence. The scheduled radio check-in time comes and goes. The radio operators listen to the static, waiting for the S-80's call sign. 10 minutes pass. 30 minutes. An hour. The storm outside howls against the radio towers on the shore. It takes time for the realization to set in. In a military system, no one wants to be the first to declare an emergency. Maybe their radio is broken. Maybe the storm is interfering with the signal. Hope is a powerful delay tactic. But as the night wears on, the silence transforms from a technical annoyance into a terrifying void. Ships are eventually dispatched. Aircraft are scrambled into the gale. They scan the dark, heaving water for an oil slick, a distress buoy, or a flare. But the S-80 has left no trace. The sea has swallowed her whole, sealing the valve that the ice kept open, hiding the evidence of the failure. The disappearance of the S-80 becomes an immediate mystery. In the tense atmosphere of the Cold War, the first assumption is often enemy action. Did they hit a drifting mine? Did a NATO submarine ram them? The Soviet Navy locks down the information. The families are told nothing. The empty barracks beds are stripped. The investigation begins in a vacuum of evidence. But the S-80 is not just a wreck. She is a crime scene where the victims are still waiting to testify. The men inside did not die instantly upon impact. We know this because years later, when the truth was finally dragged from the mud, the evidence would show a desperate, heartbreaking struggle for survival. They did not give up. They fought the water, they fought the cold, and they fought the darkness until the very end. But that discovery is 7 years away. For now, in the winter of 1961, there is only the storm, the cold, and the unanswerable question of how a routine patrol could end in total erasure. The S-80 becomes a ghost ship, the first of our 5 tragedies, setting the stage for a pattern that will repeat itself with sickening regularity. A small technical failure, a moment of human hesitation, and a system that cannot protect its own. For 7 years, the fate of the S-80 remained one of the Northern Fleet's darkest secrets. The ocean floor held its prisoner tightly, refusing to yield the location of the wreck. It wasn't until the summer of 1969, a lifetime later in the fast-moving history of the Cold War, that the submarine was finally located. The Soviet Navy launched an unprecedented salvage operation, codenamed Depth, or Glubina. It was a massive engineering challenge, involving specialized recovery ships, heavy-lift pontoons, and deep-sea divers working at the limits of human endurance. When the rusted, barnacle-encrusted hull of the S-80 finally broke the surface and was towed back to a secret dry dock, it offered a grim time capsule of the disaster. As the hatch was cracked open for the first time in nearly a decade, the stale air of 1961 rushed out, carrying with it the heavy silence of the tomb. The investigation inside the wreck revealed a heartbreaking story of survival. The initial theory, that the crew had drowned instantly, was shattered by what the salvage teams found. In the forward compartments, far from the flooded engine room, the bodies of the sailors were found in their bunks or at their battle stations. But in the aft compartments, the scene was different. The watertight doors between the compartments were sealed shut, dogged down tight from the inside. This simple fact told a story of immense discipline and sacrifice. The men in the flooded engine room had not tried to flee forward, which would have doomed the rest of the ship. They had stayed at their posts or died trying to seal the leaks, while their comrades on the other side of the bulkhead locked the doors to contain the water. Evidence suggested that nearly half the crew had survived the initial impact with the seabed. In the forward torpedo room and the living quarters, men had lived for hours, perhaps even days. The emergency oxygen regeneration canisters were deployed. The rations had been opened. They had huddled in the freezing darkness, waiting for the rescue that never came. The forensic analysis of the machinery confirmed the frozen valve theory. The snorkel intake valve was indeed jammed with ice residue or mechanical deformation consistent with icing. But the investigation also pointed to a cascade of human errors. The heating system for the valve, designed to melt the ice, had been turned off or was malfunctioning. The trim system valves were in the wrong position. The crew, exhausted by the storm and lulled by routine, had missed the crucial indicators on the control panel. Yet, to label this simply human error is to miss the larger point. Why was a single valve capable of sinking an entire warship? Why was there no secondary backup system that automatically slammed the hull opening shut if water was detected? The design of the S-80 relied entirely on the perfect functioning of a mechanical float and the perfect vigilance of a tired sailor. The system had no redundancy. It assumed perfection in an environment, the Arctic winter, that guarantees imperfection. The S-80 disaster was classified secret. The lessons learned were shared only within narrow technical circles. The public was told nothing. The families were given vague condolences. And because the failure was hidden, the culture that produced it remained unchanged. The belief that routine equals safe continued to permeate the fleet. Fast forward 22 years. It is June 1983. The location shifts from the icy Barents Sea to the Pacific Ocean off the coast of the Kamchatka Peninsula. The submarine is the K-429. If the S-80 was an old workhorse, the K-429 is a predator. She is a Project 670 Charlie-class nuclear submarine, armed with anti-ship cruise missiles designed to hunt American aircraft carriers. She is a complex, powerful machine, powered by a nuclear reactor and staffed by a crew of over 100 men. But the K-429 is a ship in distress long before she leaves the pier. She has just returned from a long, grueling patrol. Her crew has been dismissed for leave. The submarine itself is in a state of disassembly. Her systems are being overhauled, her valves are stripped for maintenance, and her crew is scattered across the Soviet Union, visiting families. Then, the order comes down from the fleet command. A torpedo firing exercise needs to be conducted. The scheduled submarine has broken down. K-429 is ordered to take its place. The captain, Captain First Rank Nikolai Suvorov, protests. He tells his superiors the truth. The ship is not ready. The crew is not here. We are under repair. It is a brave act of defiance in a military culture that values obedience above all else. But the command is unyielding. The plan must be fulfilled. The exercise is part of the political metrics of readiness. To cancel it would look bad on a report to Moscow. Suvorov is given an ultimatum: sail or be stripped of command and expelled from the party. He is forced to assemble a scratch crew. He pulls men from the barracks, from other ships, from wherever he can find them. Some of these sailors have never set foot on K-429. They don't know the layout of the valves. They don't know their shipmates' names. It is a recipe for disaster, baked into the mission before the lines are even cast off. On June 24th, K-429 limps away from the pier. She sails not to the deep ocean, but to a shallow training area just a few miles from the base, in Saranyaya Bay. The water here is relatively shallow, only about 120 to 140 feet deep. In submarine terms, this is practically wading depth. If she were standing on her tail, her bow would stick out of the water. This proximity to home creates a dangerous psychological illusion. We are just outside the harbor, the crew thinks. The water is shallow. If something goes wrong, we can just surface. We are safe. But they are not safe. They are sailing a broken ship with a blind crew. As they prepare for a test dive, the critical error is made. Because the ship was in maintenance, the main ventilation valves, massive openings in the hull used to circulate air while on the surface, were locked in the open position or were not properly connected to the hydraulic system that closes them. The indicators in the control room show closed, but the physical valves are open. The interlocks that should prevent a dive with open valves have been bypassed or are malfunctioning due to the incomplete repairs. Captain Suvorov orders the dive. The ballast tanks vent their air. The submarine begins to submerge. Usually, a dive is a smooth, controlled descent, but immediately something is wrong. The submarine feels heavy. She sinks too fast. And then, the scream comes over the intercom from the fourth compartment. Water in the fourth compartment! Flooding! The ventilation shaft, wide open to the sea, acts like a funnel. Thousands of gallons of water rush into the forward section of the ship. The fourth compartment is a critical space. It houses the control systems and living quarters. The water hits the electrical panels. Sparks fly. Smoke fills the air. Suvorov reacts instantly. Blow all ballast. Emergency surface. But the K-429 is too heavy. The water is pouring in faster than the air can push the submarine up. The laws of buoyancy have been violated again, just like on the S-80. The nuclear-powered giant drops like a stone. Within seconds, she hits the bottom. The impact is jarring. The submarine shudders and comes to rest on the seabed, listing slightly to one side. She is only 140 feet down, so close to the surface that if you looked up through the periscope, you might see the sunlight filtering through the green water. But inside, the situation is catastrophic. The fourth compartment is flooding rapidly. The men inside are fighting a losing battle against the rising water. They retreat, sealing the bulkhead behind them, trapping themselves in the flooded section to save the rest of the ship. 14 men die in those first few minutes, drowned in their own station or killed by the initial shock. The rest of the crew, 106 men, are now trapped alive in the forward and aft compartments. The ship is dead. The reactor has scrammed, shut down automatically. The lights are out. The air is beginning to foul. This is the nightmare scenario. Trapped on the bottom, just a few miles from home, with a crew that barely knows each other. But unlike the S-80, the K-429 is in shallow water. This fact, while it didn't save them from sinking, now offers a sliver of hope. However, a new problem emerges. Because the mission was so rushed, the emergency buoys, which are supposed to float to the surface and release a radio beacon, have been welded shut to prevent them from being lost in rough seas, a common, if unauthorized, practice. The K-429 cannot signal for help. The base is less than 10 miles away. Officers are drinking coffee, looking at the charts, waiting for the K-429 to report dive complete. But the radio is silent. The hours tick by. Just like with S-80, the system is slow to react. Maybe their radio is broken, they say. Maybe they are running silent. Down on the bottom, Captain Suvorov realizes that no one is coming. He is the commander of a sunken nuclear submarine, responsible for over 100 lives. The air is getting colder. The carbon dioxide levels are rising. He has to make a decision. The standard procedure is to wait for rescue. Soviet doctrine is strict. Sit tight, conserve oxygen, and wait for the divers. But Suvorov knows the reality. He knows the rescue ships are slow. He knows the buoys are welded down. He knows that if they wait, they will die. He decides to do the unthinkable. He decides to break the rules to save his men. He begins to plan an escape. Not a waiting game, but an active, desperate breakout. The plan involves using the torpedo tubes. The men will have to crawl into the narrow, greasy steel tubes, flood them with freezing water to equalize the pressure, open the outer door, and swim to the surface. It is a terrifying prospect. The water pressure at 140 feet is enough to rupture eardrums and cause the bends if the ascent is too fast. And many of the conscripts on board have never done escape training. They are kids, pulled from the barracks 2 days ago, now being told to swim for their lives out of a sunken tomb. Suvorov gathers his officers. The mood is grim. The fourth compartment is full of watering corpses. The survivors are huddled in the dark, listening to the creaking of the hull. The decision is made. They will send 2 volunteers out first, 2 of the most experienced warrant officers, to reach the surface, swim to shore, and raise the alarm. It is a desperate gamble. If they fail, if they drown on the way up, or freeze to death on the surface, the rest of the crew will likely die waiting. The preparations begin. Men are checking the escape suits, heavy rubberized gear designed to provide buoyancy and warmth. Some suits are missing, some are torn. They have to improvise. They share gear. They give the best suits to the youngest sailors. As they prepare to flood the torpedo tube for the first escape attempt, the irony of the situation is crushing. They are so close to safety. Just 140 feet of water separates them from the air. They can probably hear the propellers of passing fishing boats above them. But that 140 feet is a wall of death. The sinking of the K-429 was not caused by enemy action. It was caused by a command structure that refused to hear the word no. It was caused by an admiral who valued a checkmark on a training schedule more than the physical reality of a dismantled ship. The water that flooded the fourth compartment did not enter because of a torpedo hole. It entered because the system had already been breached by negligence long before the submarine left the dock. Now, as the first 2 men crawl into the dark tube, holding their breath, the question is no longer about the mission. It is about whether the human spirit can overcome the failures of the state. Can they save themselves when the system has already condemned them? Inside the sunken hull of K-429, the air is growing heavy with carbon dioxide. It has been hours since the submarine hit the seabed. The cold is seeping through the steel plates, numbing the fingers and slowing the minds of the trapped sailors. The decision has been made. They cannot wait for a rescue that isn't coming. They must escape on their own. 2 warrant officers, brave volunteers, crawl into the torpedo tube. The inner door is slammed shut behind them, sealing them in a steel cylinder barely wider than their shoulders. Then comes the sound of rushing water as the tube is flooded to equalize pressure with the sea outside. In the pitch blackness, freezing water fills the space around their faces. They breathe from their emergency apparatus, waiting for the pressure to stabilize. Then, the outer door opens. They push themselves out into the crushing weight of the ocean and begin their ascent. They break the surface of Saranya Bay into a gray, misty morning. They are alive. They inflate their dinghies and begin to paddle, not toward a rescue ship, but toward the shore. In a twist of grim irony, they are spotted by a coastal border patrol. The guards, unaware of any submarine disaster, initially detain them as suspected spies or defectors. It takes frantic explaining. "We are from a sunken nuclear submarine. Our crew is dying down there," before the alarm is finally raised. Only then does the massive machinery of the Pacific Fleet Rescue Service shudder into motion. Ships are dispatched. Divers are sent down. But for the men still trapped inside, the ordeal is far from over. Captain Suvorov oversees a chaotic, terrifying evacuation. Group by group, the sailors are cycled through the torpedo tubes. It is a slow, claustrophobic process. Some men panic. Some have trouble with their breathing gear. The pressure changes wreak havoc on their bodies. But over the course of several days, the majority of the crew is brought to the surface. Of the 120 men on board, 104 survive. It is a miraculous feat of self-rescue, a testament to the toughness of the submariners. But 16 men are dead, 14 in the initial flooding and 2 during the escape attempt. The aftermath, however, reveals the true cruelty of the system. Captain Suvorov, the man who warned that the ship wasn't ready, the man who improvised the escape and saved over 100 lives, is not hailed as a hero. He is arrested. The investigation is swift and brutal. The Naval Command needs a scapegoat to deflect from the fact that they ordered an unseaworthy ship to sea. Suvorov is charged with violating safety regulations. At his trial, he attempts to speak the truth. "I told you the ship wasn't ready. You ordered me to go." His testimony is dismissed. The admiral who gave the order is not in the dock. Suvorov is sentenced to 10 years in prison. The K-429 disaster exposes a terrifying aspect of the Soviet naval culture: the supremacy of the plan. In this system, reality is secondary to the paperwork. If the plan says the submarine is ready, then it is ready, regardless of the missing valves or the untrained crew. To point out the discrepancy is not seen as safety consciousness. It is seen as insubordination. The system punishes the truth teller and rewards the risk taker, until the risk turns into a catastrophe. Then, the risk taker is punished, and the system remains unchanged. But while the K-429 disaster was loud, violent, and visible, another tragedy was unfolding elsewhere, one that was silent, invisible, and perhaps even more horrific. This brings us to our third story, the K-27. If S-80 was a workhorse and K-429 was a warrior, K-27 is a science experiment. Launched in the early 1960s, she is a unique vessel, the only one of her kind, Project 645. She is the Goldfish, a nickname given partly for her cost and partly for her golden promise. She represents the cutting edge of Soviet nuclear technology. Most nuclear submarines use pressurized water to cool their reactors. It is a proven, stable technology. But K-27 is different. Her reactors are cooled by a liquid metal alloy of lead and bismuth. The theory is seductive. Liquid metal can transfer heat much more efficiently than water. This allows for a smaller, lighter reactor that can produce immense power, giving the submarine incredible speed and acceleration. It is the holy grail of submarine design. But there is a catch. The liquid metal must never be allowed to freeze. If the temperature of the coolant drops below 257 degrees Fahrenheit, the metal solidifies, turning the reactor into a useless block of lead. This means the reactor can never be truly shut down. It must always be hot, always running, always demanding attention. The crew of the K-27 are not just sailors. They are technicians, chosen for their intelligence. They are proud of their golden ship, but they are also riding a prototype that has not been fully tamed. The technology is immature. The material science hasn't quite caught up to the engineering ambition. On May 24, 1968, K-27 is in the Barents Sea, conducting high-speed trials. The captain, Pavel Leonov, is pushing the boat through its paces. The reactor is running at high power. Then, inevitably, the warning signs appear. In the control room, the instruments for the port-side reactor begin to behave erratically. The power output drops suddenly, from 83 to 7. This is a massive, inexplicable fluctuation. At the same time, the radiation sensors in the reactor compartment spike. Gamma radiation levels begin to climb. In a normal safety culture, this is the moment you stop. You surface. You shut down the reactor. You evacuate the compartment. You call for a tow. But the culture of the Golden Submarine is one of pioneering endurance. It's just a sensor glitch, the logic goes. The liquid metal flow is tricky. We can stabilize it. The crew attempts to troubleshoot the reactor while it is still running. They try to boost the power to keep the metal from freezing. They are fighting the physics of the machine. What they don't know, what the sensors are failing to tell them clearly, is that the reactor core has suffered a catastrophic failure. Debris or oxides in the liquid metal have clogged the cooling channels. The coolant has stopped flowing to a section of the fuel rods. The fuel is melting. The cladding is cracking. Highly radioactive fission products are leaking directly into the coolant loop and, from there, into the compartment. This is not a leak in the traditional sense. Radiation does not drip. It does not hiss. It beams through the steel walls of the pipes. It fills the air with invisible, energetic particles that tear through human DNA like microscopic bullets. The gas activity monitors go off the scale. The needle slams against the stop and stays there. The alarm is finally sounding, but the sound of a siren cannot stop the neutrons. The crew works desperately to save the ship. They know that if the reactor freezes, the ship is lost. They are trapped in the paradox of the liquid metal design. To save the ship, they must keep the broken reactor hot. To save themselves, they must shut it down and run away. They choose the ship. Sailors enter the reactor compartment to effect repairs or manually adjust valves. They are wearing standard protective gear, thin suits and masks that offer negligible protection against the hard gamma rays and neutron flux pouring out of the core. They are walking into a death zone. One by one, the men begin to feel sick. It starts with a metallic taste in the mouth. Then comes the nausea, the vomiting, the terrible weakness. These are the classic symptoms of acute radiation syndrome. They are being cooked from the inside out. The captain finally realizes the battle is lost. He orders the reactor shut down. The K-27 surfaces, but the damage is done. The port reactor is ruined, and the crew is dying. The submarine limps back to base on its single remaining engine. The journey takes 5 hours. 5 hours of exposure. The radiation has spread through the ventilation system. It is in the clothes, in the hair, in the lungs of the crew. When K-27 arrives at the pier in Gremika, the scene is horrific. Ambulances are waiting, but the medical staff is unprepared for the scale of the contamination. Men are carried off on stretchers, their faces pale, their bodies retching. The official response is immediate secrecy. The submarine is towed to a remote corner of the harbor. The crew is flown to hospitals in Leningrad and Moscow. But the diagnosis is hidden. The medical records are falsified. Vegetative vascular dystonia, or asthenic syndrome, are written instead of acute radiation poisoning. 9 men die quickly, horrible, agonizing deaths as their bone marrow dissolves and their organs fail. But dozens more are scarred for life. They will develop cancers, blood diseases, and chronic illnesses years later. They are the walking ghosts of the K-27. The analysis of the K-27 disaster reveals a different kind of systemic failure. This was not about a missing valve or a rushed schedule. This was about technological hubris. The Soviet Union, in its race for supremacy, fielded a technology that was inherently unsafe. The liquid metal reactor was a brilliant idea on paper, but in practice, it was a trap. The system treated the crew as expendable components of the experiment. When the choice was between the safety of the men and the preservation of the golden submarine, the protocols favored the machine. The men were expected to absorb the radiation to keep the reactor alive. They were human control rods, sacrificed to the god of efficiency. K-27 was never repaired. She was too radioactive to touch. For years, she sat rusting at a pier, a hot ship that no one wanted. Eventually, she was towed out to the Kara Sea and scuttled, sunk deliberately in shallow water, her reactor compartment filled with bitumen. She lies there today, a nuclear time bomb on the ocean floor, a monument to a technology that demanded too high a price. These stories, S-80, K-429, K-27, show us the spectrum of disaster. We have seen the mechanical failure in the storm. We have seen the bureaucratic negligence at the pier. We have seen the invisible killer of radiation. But there is another way a submarine can die, one that combines the terror of the deep with the primal fear of fire. This leads us to the fourth disaster, perhaps the most tragic of them all, the K-8. K-8 is a November-class nuclear submarine, the first generation of Soviet nuclear boats. She is big, fast, and noisy. In April 1970, she is in the Bay of Biscay, north of Spain, participating in a massive naval exercise called Okean 70. This is the Soviet Navy's grand coming-out party, a global demonstration of power involving hundreds of ships. K-8 is on her way home. She has been at sea for weeks. The crew is tired but in high spirits. They are deep in the Atlantic, far from the Arctic bases. On the evening of April 8th, alarm bells shatter the peace. Fire. Fire on a submarine is not like fire in a house. You cannot run outside. The fire consumes the same oxygen you need to breathe. It produces toxic smoke, carbon monoxide, hydrogen chloride from burning insulation, that fills the enclosed steel tube in seconds. And because a submarine is a pressure vessel, the heat has nowhere to go. It turns the hull into an oven. On K-8, the fire starts in 2 compartments simultaneously, the 3rd and 7th compartments. This suggests an electrical fault, perhaps a short circuit in the wiring that spread through the cable runs. The smoke spreads instantly. The captain, Vsevolod Bessonov, orders the reactor shut down to prevent a meltdown, but the fire is out of control. The men in the affected compartments realize they cannot put it out. They make the ultimate decision. To save the rest of the ship, the men in the burning compartments seal themselves in. They spin the wheels of the watertight doors, locking themselves in with the fire. They know they are dying. They can feel the heat rising, the smoke choking them. But if they open the door to escape, the fire will spread to the control room, to the reactor, to the torpedoes. This act of heroism buys the ship time. K-8 surfaces. The crew spills out onto the deck, gasping for air in the rough Atlantic swell. Smoke is pouring from the hatches. The submarine is dead in the water, drifting without power. But the tragedy of K-8 is not just about the fire. It is about what happens next. It is about the agonizing, slow-motion disaster of the rescue. The K-27 Goldfish remains a ghost in the history of naval engineering, a brilliant, lethal failure. Following the 1968 radiation accident, the Soviet Navy quietly abandoned the liquid metal technology for mainstream use. The surviving crew members were sworn to secrecy, their medical records sanitized to hide the true cause of their deteriorating health. They returned to civilian life, carrying the invisible scars of the atom, while their ship was towed to a remote bay, filled with hardening agents, and eventually sunk in the Kara Sea. She lies there still, a silent warning about the cost of technological hubris. But while K-27 was a story of invisible death, the tragedy of the K-8 is a story of visceral, terrifying chaos in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean. It is April 8, 1970. The K-8, a November-class nuclear submarine, is surfacing in the Bay of Biscay. Inside the hull, the atmosphere is apocalyptic. Fire is raging in two separate compartments. Compartment 3, the electrical center, and Compartment 7, the electric motor room. The ship is filled with thick, acrid smoke. The lights are dead. The reactor has been scrammed, leaving the vessel without propulsion. The captain, Vsevolod Besanov, has made the critical decision to surface. As the K-8 breaks the waves, the crew begins to evacuate the smoke-filled interior. Hatches are thrown open, and men stumble out onto the narrow, rolling deck, coughing up black soot, their eyes streaming. But not everyone makes it out. In the burning compartments, the sailors who sealed the doors to contain the fire have already perished. They died at their posts, sacrificing themselves to prevent the flames from reaching the reactor control room or the torpedo magazine. Their silence is the price of the ship's survival thus far. Now, the K-8 is a crippled hulk, drifting in heavy seas. The weather is worsening. A storm is building, whipping the Atlantic into 15-foot waves that crash over the low casing of the submarine. The crew huddles on the bridge, and the casing, exposed to the wind and spray, watching smoke billow from their home. Nearby, the ocean is not empty. There are other ships, civilian vessels. A Canadian cargo ship, the Clydesdale, spots the distress flares and approaches. Later, an American reconnaissance plane flies overhead, photographing the stricken Soviet submarine. In a normal world, this would be the moment of rescue. The laws of the sea dictate that any ship must help mariners in distress. But this is the Cold War. For a Soviet nuclear submarine captain, accepting help from a Western ship, especially a NATO-aligned vessel, is fraught with political danger. It could be seen as treason, or at least a humiliating propaganda defeat. Captain Besonov refuses the offers of assistance. He waits for his own side. Eventually, Soviet vessels arrive. A rescue ship and a merchant vessel reach the scene. They begin the difficult process of taking the crew off the K-8. The majority of the sailors are transferred to the safety of the support ships. They are cold, poisoned by carbon monoxide, and traumatized, but they are alive. However, the Naval Command in Moscow has a different priority. The ship must be saved. A nuclear submarine is a strategic asset worth millions of rubles. It is filled with classified codes and technology. It cannot be allowed to sink, and it certainly cannot be allowed to be boarded by the Americans. The order is given: prepare to tow the K-8 back to port. To tow a submarine, you need a crew on board. You need men to steer, to monitor the buoyancy, to handle the tow lines. Captain Besonov selects a skeleton crew to remain behind. He stays, of course. The captain never leaves the ship while she is still afloat. With him are his senior officers and a handful of key specialists. In total, 22 men remain on the burning, powerless submarine. This decision, to leave men on board a ship that has been gutted by fire and is taking on water, is the pivot point of the tragedy. It reflects a deep-seated tenet of naval culture, particularly strong in the Soviet fleet. The ship comes first. Abandoning a ship that is still floating is seen as a failure of duty, perhaps even cowardice. For 3 days, the K-8 fights for its life. The towing operation is a nightmare. The tow cables snap in the heavy seas. The weather batters the submarine, rolling it violently. Inside, the skeleton crew is living in hell. The air is toxic. They are exhausted, running on adrenaline and loyalty. They have no power, no heat, and limited communications. On the morning of April 12th, the situation turns critical. The fire has likely burned through seals or gaskets in the stern. Water begins to flood the aft compartments. The K-8 loses its longitudinal stability. The stern begins to settle. The bow rises. The men on the support ships watch in horror as the silhouette of the K-8 changes. She is losing her battle with buoyancy. Captain Bessonov realizes the end is near, but it is too late to evacuate. The sea is too rough for a small boat transfer, and the submarine is sinking too fast. The men on the bridge of the K-8 are trapped. At 6:20 a.m., the K-8 slips beneath the waves. She goes down stern first, taking 22 men with her into the abyss of the Atlantic. They die not because the fire killed them instantly, but because the system demanded they try to save a piece of steel that was already doomed. The total death toll is 52, the 30 men who died in the initial fire and the 22 who died during the failed towing operation. The loss of the K-8 is a stark example of the conflict between human value and material value. In the calculus of the Cold War, the submarine was an asset to be recovered at almost any cost. The courage of the crew was weaponized against them. Their willingness to stay, to fight for the ship, was exploited by a command structure that should have ordered them off the moment the tow line snapped. As the K-8 settles onto the bottom of the Bay of Biscay, 3 miles down, she becomes a permanent tomb. And yet, the lesson is not learned. The pressure to save the hardware continues to dominate the decision-making process in future accidents. We move now from the Atlantic to the Baltic Sea and backward in time to 1957. Our final story concerns a submarine that was much smaller, much simpler, and yet fell victim to the same systemic blindness. This is the story of the M256. The M256 is a Project A615 submarine, known to NATO as the Quebec class. She is a pocket submarine, small, coastal, designed for short-range patrols. She does not have a nuclear reactor. She does not carry huge missiles. She seems, by comparison, almost harmless. But the M256 carries a secret weapon that makes her one of the most dangerous ships in the fleet: her engine. She is powered by a closed-cycle diesel system that uses liquid oxygen, LOX, to allow the engine to run while submerged. Liquid oxygen is a terrifying substance. It is cryogenic, meaning it must be kept at hundreds of degrees below zero. It is highly reactive. If it comes into contact with oil, grease, or even asphalt, it can cause them to explode spontaneously. It turns any organic material into a high explosive. The Quebec class was nicknamed the cigarette lighter by its crews. This was not a term of endearment. It was a recognition that they were sailing inside a floating bomb. On September 26, 1957, the M256 is conducting speed trials in the Gulf of Finland. The weather is rough, with a strong gale blowing. The submarine is running on its diesel engines using the liquid oxygen system. Suddenly, a fire breaks out in the engine compartment. The cause is likely a leak in the liquid oxygen system. A seal fails, or a pipe cracks under the stress of the vibration. The pure oxygen hits the hot diesel fumes and oil of the engine room. The result is not just a fire, it is an inferno. The oxygen feeds the flames with a ferocity that melts steel. The captain, Lieutenant Commander Yuri Vavilov, orders an immediate emergency surface. The submarine shoots to the surface. The crew spills out onto the deck. But unlike the K-8, they cannot seal the compartment and wait. The fire is being fed by the liquid oxygen tank itself. It is a blowtorch burning from the inside out. The fire is so intense that the paint on the outer hull begins to blister and peel. The seawater around the hull boils. The crew, huddled on the narrow casing, are trapped between the freezing spray of the Baltic storm and the radiating heat of their dying ship. Ships are nearby. The M256 is close to the coast. A destroyer and a rescue vessel are within sight, but the storm makes a rescue difficult. The waves are too high to bring a ship alongside. For hours, the M256 drifts, burning. The crew waits. They believe they are safe because they are on the surface. They believe the fire will burn itself out, or that the rescue ships will find a way to take them off. But they are underestimating the structural damage being done to the hull. The intense heat is weakening the steel plates of the pressure hull. The liquid oxygen is effectively cutting the submarine in half. And then, the simple submarine delivers its final, fatal surprise. The M256 is dying, but she is dying slowly. For nearly 4 hours, the submarine drifts on the surface of the Baltic Sea, battered by the gale. The fire in the engine room continues to roar, fed by the leaking liquid oxygen. To the crew gathered on the open deck, shivering in the freezing spray, the situation feels desperate but stable. They are out of the smoke. They are visible to the rescue ships circling nearby. They believe the worst is over. This belief, that surfaced equals safe, is the final illusion. What the crew cannot see is the metallurgical catastrophe unfolding beneath their feet. The intense heat of the oxygen-fed fire is not just burning the interior, it is annealing the pressure hull. The steel, designed to withstand the crushing depths of the ocean, is losing its temper. It is becoming soft, pliable, and brittle. The structural integrity of the aft section is effectively dissolving. At the same time, the fire is consuming the seals of the seawater intake valves. The ocean is beginning to leak into the engine compartment, not as a flood, but as a steady, stealthy accumulation of weight. The submarine is slowly losing its reserve buoyancy, settling lower into the water with every passing minute. The rescue ships, the destroyer Stoichi and the submarine tender Smolny, are agonizingly close. But the captains of these vessels are hesitant. They are afraid of the M256. They know she is a cigarette lighter, a floating bomb loaded with liquid oxygen. If she explodes while they are alongside, she could take the rescue ship down with her. The fear of the technology paralyzes the rescue effort. They keep their distance, waiting for the fire to subside or the weather to break. On the deck of the M256, the men are exhausted. The adrenaline is fading, replaced by the numbing cold. They watch the destroyer heave in the waves, wondering why it doesn't come closer. Then, at 1500 hours, physics delivers the final verdict. The stability of the submarine vanishes in an instant. The water inside the aft compartment shifts. The stern drops heavily. The bow shoots up into the air, vertical, like a tombstone marking its own grave. The sudden lurch throws the men on the deck into the freezing water. There is no time to launch rafts. There is no time to organize. The submarine slides backwards into the depths, accompanied by a massive release of bubbles and debris. The men are now swimming for their lives in the oil-covered, storm-tossed water. The rescue ships finally move in, but it is chaotic. The heavy seas make it difficult to spot the heads bobbing in the waves. The oil slick makes the swimmers slippery and hard to grab. Of the 35 men who were on deck when she sank, only 7 are pulled from the water alive. The rest drown, or succumb to hypothermia, or are lost in the confusion. The captain, Lieutenant Commander Vavilov, is among the dead. He had remained on his ship until the very end, ensuring his men were on deck, only to be taken by the sea when the hull gave way. The loss of the M256 is a tragedy of simple technology gone wrong. It wasn't a complex nuclear reactor or a strategic missile system that killed them. It was a propulsion system, liquid oxygen, that was known to be dangerous, installed in a ship that was considered routine. The system treated the risk as acceptable. It treated the crew as lucky to be on a modern boat. But when the fire started, the system, in the form of the hesitant rescue ships, backed away, leaving the crew to pay the price for the design flaws. We have now examined 5 disasters. S-80, the frozen valve that sank a ship in silence. K-429, the unready submarine ordered to dive at its own doorstep. K-27, the experimental reactor that poisoned its crew to stay alive. K-8, the fire where the mission to save the steel cost 22 lives. M256, the cigarette lighter that burned and sank while help watched. 5 different submarines, 5 different years. But when you lay the blueprints of these disasters side by side, they stop looking like isolated accidents. They begin to look like a single, repeating image. This brings us to the core of our investigation, the system. If you look at the immediate causes, water, fire, radiation, gas, they seem distinct, but these are just the executioners. The judge that sentenced these men to death was the same in every case. It was a systemic philosophy that permeated the Soviet Navy and, to varying degrees, all high-pressure military organizations. Let's trace the threads that connect these tragedies. First, the illusion of routine. In every single case, the disaster struck during what was considered a standard operation. S-80 was on a routine patrol. K-429 was doing a training dive. M256 was on speed trials. The system is designed to handle high-alert crises. It is terrible at handling the mundane. When the crew believes this is just a drill, their guard drops. The system encourages this. It pushes for a high operational tempo, more drills, more miles, more tests, which normalizes the risk. The extraordinary danger of being underwater in a steel tube becomes background noise until the noise stops. Second, the silence of the warning. Before every disaster, the machine spoke. On S-80, the valve heater was known to be tricky. On K-429, the captain literally told the admiral, "We are not ready." On K-27, the reactor sensors were fluctuating before the power drop. On M256, the liquid oxygen system was notoriously unstable. The warnings were there, but the system had no mechanism to hear them. In a culture of rigid hierarchy, a warning from below is often treated as a complaint, or worse, as cowardice. The pressure to fulfill the plan acts as a filter, blocking out the data that contradicts the goal. The captain who says, "Stop," is a problem. The captain who says, "We will try," is a hero, right up until he sinks. Third, the fetishization of the hardware. In the K-8 and K-27 disasters, we see a chilling priority. Save the ship first, the people second. The men on K-27 stood in a radiation beam to keep the metal liquid. The men on K-8 stayed on a burning wreck to tow it home. The system views the submarine as the irreplaceable asset. The crew is viewed as the renewable resource. This is not necessarily malice. It is the cold arithmetic of the Cold War. A nuclear submarine takes years to build and costs a fortune. A crew can be drafted in a month. This logic is never written down in a manual, but it is written in the actions of the command. Fourth, the compromise of rescue. When the worst happens, the rescue response is consistently paralyzed by the same secrecy that caused the accident. On S-80, no one knew where to look. On K-429, the buoys were welded shut. On M256, The rescue ships were afraid to approach. The obsession with secrecy, with hiding the failure from the enemy, often ends up hiding the survivors from their saviors. This systemic analysis reveals that the 178 men who died in these 5 events were not killed by the ocean. The ocean is simply a force of nature. It has no intent. They were killed by a system that believed it could cheat the odds. They were killed by the belief that you can cut corners on safety if you have enough courage. They were killed by the idea that a schedule printed in Moscow has more authority than the laws of physics. These were not accidents in the true sense. An accident is unforeseeable. These events were probabilistic certainties. If you run a fleet this way long enough, S-80 will happen. K-429 will happen. The names of the boats change, but the script remains the same. The water enters, the fire starts, the men fight, and the system watches, taking notes for the next report, but rarely changing the underlying logic. As we move to our conclusion, we must confront the most painful truth of all. It is not just that these men died, it is that most of them could have lived. The technology existed to save them. The procedures existed to protect them. All that was missing was the willingness to say, "Stop. This is too dangerous." And that simple sentence, "Stop," is the hardest thing to say in a uniform. The M256 is gone. The Baltic Sea has reclaimed the cigarette lighter, leaving only an oil slick and a handful of shivering survivors to testify to its end. But as the rescue ships turn back toward the coast, carrying the living and the dead, the echoes of the disaster begin to merge with the others we have witnessed. The fire of the M256, the ice of the S-80, the radiation of the K-27, the smoke of the K-8, and the flooding of the K-429. These are not 5 separate stories. They are 5 chapters in a single, devastating textbook on failure. When we place these disasters side by side, stripping away the specific dates and coordinates, a disturbing architecture emerges. We see that the specific agent of death, whether it be water, fire, gas, or neutrons, is almost irrelevant. These hazards are the constant companions of the submariner. They are the dragons that live in the basement. The true killer, the one that unlocks the door and lets the dragon upstairs, is always the system. Let us dissect the anatomy of this system. It is built on 3 foundational pillars, each of which contributed to the death toll. The first pillar, the normalized deviation. Sociologist Diane Vaughan coined the term normalization of deviance to describe the Challenger space shuttle disaster, but it applies perfectly here. It is the gradual process where a safety violation becomes the new standard. On the S-80, the anti-icing system was known to be troublesome, so crews got used to managing it manually. It worked 99 times, so they assumed it would work the 100th time. On the K-429, sailing with unfinished repairs became an acceptable risk because everyone does it to meet quotas. The deviation from the rule became the rule. On the M256, the instability of liquid oxygen was treated as a quirk of the boat, something a good crew could handle, rather than a lethal design flaw. The system slowly drifts away from safety, step by step, until the edge of the cliff is no longer visible. The men don't realize they are in danger because the danger has become their daily routine. The second pillar, the cult of the mission. In the Soviet Navy, the plan was sacred. Combat readiness was not just a goal, it was an ideology. This created a pressure cooker where stopping a mission for safety reasons was equated with political failure. Captain Suvorov of the K-429 tried to stop. He stood in front of an admiral and said, "We are not ready." He was threatened with expulsion from the party. The system had no brakes. It only had an accelerator. On the K-27, the pressure to prove the liquid metal technology worked led the command to keep the reactor running even when it was clearly failing. The mission, validate the technology, overrode the survival of the crew. This pillar transforms prudence into cowardice. A captain who aborts a drill because of a faulty valve is seen as weak. A captain who pushes through and makes it work is promoted. This selection bias ensures that the fleet is run by risk-takers, filtering out the cautious voices that might prevent a disaster. The third pillar, secrecy as a safety hazard. We have seen how secrecy crippled the rescue efforts. The welded buoys of the K-429, the hesitation of the rescue ships near M-256, the refusal of K-8 to accept Western aid. But secrecy does something even more insidious. It prevents learning. Because the S-80 disaster was hidden, other Whiskey-class crews didn't learn the full horror of the snorkel icing failure. Because the K-27 radiation accident was covered up, the medical protocols for treating radiation sickness didn't improve as fast as they could have. In an open system, an accident is a tragedy, but it is also data. It is dissected, published, and used to update the manuals. In a closed system, an accident is a shame to be buried. The data dies with the men. The fleet suffers from a kind of institutional amnesia, where every generation has to rediscover the same lethal lessons for themselves. These pillars support a structure where the human being is the most flexible component. Steel breaks, electronics fry, but a human can be ordered to work harder, to stay awake longer, to ignore the radiation, to fix the valve in the storm. The system relies on the heroism of its sailors to patch over the cracks in its design, and the sailors are heroes. That is the heartbreaking constant in all these stories. The men in the aft compartment of S-80 who sealed the doors. The men of K-8 who stayed on the burning ship. The volunteers on K-429 who crawled into the torpedo tubes. Their courage is undeniable. But as we analyze the system, we must ask a difficult question. Is heroism a sign of a good system or a bad one? In a perfectly safe system, heroism shouldn't be necessary. Heroism is what you need when the safeguards have failed. Heroism is the last line of defense when the engineering and the procedures have collapsed. The fact that the Soviet submarine service is full of heroes is a testament to the character of the Russian sailor. But it is an indictment of the ships they sailed and the orders they followed. We must also recognize the seductive power of the most dangerous illusions that permeated the fleet. Illusion 1. Close to shore equals safe. K-429 and M-256 both died within sight of land. S-80 was on a routine patrol box. The proximity to home creates a false sense of security. The ocean is just as deep and just as cold 1 mile from the pier as it is 1,000 miles away. Illusion 2. Familiar equals controllable. We fear the new and the strange. We don't fear the snorkel valve we've operated 1,000 times. But it is the familiar object that kills you when it fails, because you aren't watching it. Illusion 3. Courage can fix physics. This is the most dangerous illusion of all. The belief that if you just work hard enough, are brave enough, and are loyal enough, you can keep a broken reactor from melting or a flooded ship from sinking. But physics is indifferent to courage. It doesn't care about your medals or your rank. If the buoyancy is negative, you sink. If the neutrons are loose, you die. As we look at the wreckage of these 5 submarines, scattered across the Barents, the Pacific, the Atlantic, and the Baltic, we see a map of the Cold War's hidden cost. We usually measure the cost of that conflict in dollars spent or warheads built. But the true cost is found here, in the empty bunks and the grieving families. These 178 men were not casualties of war. They were casualties of a mindset. They were the collateral damage of a system that forgot that its primary duty was not just to build ships, but to bring them home. Now, as we prepare to close this file, we are left with the final, lingering question. It is not about history. It is about the present. Have we learned? Or are we still building systems in space, in energy, in AI, where we prioritize the mission over the safety, and where we count on heroism to save us when the plan goes wrong? The waters of the world's oceans have long since closed over the hulls of the S-80, the K-8, the M-256, and the K-27. The K-429 was eventually raised, only to sink again at the pier years later, a final, grim punchline to its tragic history. The men who lived through these disasters are now old, their numbers dwindling with each passing winter. The men who died are frozen in time, eternally young in the photographs on their families' mantles. But as we step back from the specific details of valves and reactors, we are left with a final, searing truth that cuts through the fog of history. It is the most painful realization of all. Most of these people could have survived. This is not a comfortable thought. It is easier to believe in fate. It is easier to say, the sea is cruel, or war is dangerous. These platitudes absolve us of responsibility. They turn tragedy into destiny. But the evidence does not support this. The evidence points to a different verdict. The 68 men of S-80 did not have to die. A simple heated valve, a second lookout, or a backup intake seal could have saved them. The 16 men of K-429 did not have to die. If one admiral had listened to one captain and delayed the drill by 2 weeks, the tragedy would never have happened. The 9 men of K-27 did not have to die. If the program had admitted the reactor was unstable, they wouldn't have been sent to sea in a radioactive trap. The 52 men of K-8 did not have to die. If the command had prioritized the crew over the hull, they would have been evacuated to the waiting ships days before the sinking. The 35 men of M-256 did not have to die. If the rescue ships had overcome their fear and moved in, the deck could have been cleared before the plunge. These deaths were not inevitable. They were choices. They were the result of thousands of small decisions made in offices thousands of miles away from the freezing spray. They were the result of a culture that forgot the first rule of the sea: respect the danger. The core lesson of this journey is that safety is not bravery. We often confuse the two. We think of the safe man as the timid one, and the brave man as the one who takes the risk. But in the world of high-consequence technology, this is backward. Real safety is the courage to stop. It is the courage to say, no, we are not ready. It is the courage to stand up in a briefing room and say, this reading is wrong, even when everyone else wants to go home. It is the courage to accept the delay, the cost, and the reprimand, because you know that the alternative is a telegram to a mother saying her son is missing. Safety is boring. It is tedious. It is checklists and inspections and redundant systems. It doesn't make for good movie posters. But it is the only thing that keeps the ocean out. As we look at the modern world, the relevance of these stories has not faded. We no longer have the Soviet Union, but we still have complex systems. We still have pressure to cut costs, to meet deadlines, to launch the product, to beat the competition. We see the same patterns repeating in different industries. We saw it in the Challenger and Columbia shuttles. We saw it in Deepwater Horizon. We see it in the rush to deploy new technologies before they are fully understood. The temptation to normalize deviance is human nature. The desire to believe it will be fine is hardwired into us. But the ghosts of the Northern Fleet are here to remind us of the cost of that optimism. If the culture does not change, the pattern will repeat. The uniforms will be different. The flags will be different. The machines will be different. But the ending will be the same. There is a saying among submariners that the ocean is a demanding mistress. But looking back at the S-80, the K-429, the K-27, the K-8, and the M-256, we can perhaps refine that wisdom. These submarines did not die because of the sea. The sea was just doing what the sea always does, seeking a way in. They died because a system believed the sea was not dangerous. They died because the men in charge convinced themselves that their will was stronger than the water. And in the end, the water always wins. This has been a journey into the dark, cold corners of the Cold War. It is a heavy story, filled with loss and frustration. But it is also a necessary one. By remembering these men, we do more than just recount history. We acknowledge their humanity. They were not just statistics in a secret file. They were people who laughed, who wrote letters home, who complained about the food, and who, in their final moments, showed a dignity and courage that shames the system that failed them. We tell their stories not to judge them, but to learn from them, to remind ourselves that in our own lives and in our own work, the small details matter, that speaking up matters, that looking out for each other matters. Thank you for watching. Thank you for giving your time to remember the crews of the S-80, K-429, K-27, K-8, and M-256. If this film has made you think, or if it has given you a new perspective on the cost of the past, then it has done its job. Until next time, stay safe and keep watching the horizon.